Empty hotels and bargain prices. But is it now safe to go on holiday to North Africa?
The money that I take to Egypt with me is helping them survive while everything else happens.
Also coming up,
Christmas in Moscow or Antarctica, and some say the world is ending in 2012. That's all coming up on Insider Guide.
and a piece of vintage Canada. We find out why the world's clothes horses are now trotting towards Toronto. Hello and welcome to Fast Track. I'm Fiona Foster, and this is the annual World Travel Market in London, where every year national tourist boards come to flex their muscles and to try and persuade the likes of you and I to book a holiday with them. But for one group of countries, that task is going to be trickier than ever this year. 2011 has been a traumatic and seismic year for North Africa and the Middle East. And now, as we begin to consider where to go next for our vacation, we might be forgiven for asking, is it really safe now to go back? Months ago, there were scenes of joy and jubilation in Cairo's Tahrir Square as Egypt threw off the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak after weeks of protest and violence. Hopes were high then that the country would emerge as a beacon of democracy. But with parliamentary elections scheduled to start next week, people have tired of waiting for that early promise to be fulfilled. And recent days have seen bloodshed and anger return to the square. For Egypt's tourism industry, which employs 1 in 6 Egyptians, those TV pictures of renewed unrest are likely to prove a setback in what's already been a very tough year.
At this time of year, thousands upon thousands of tourists are supposed to be flocking in, taking the journey of a lifetime on camelback in the side of the pyramids. But according to many camel owners, that's not the case. The picture isn't as bleak for Sharm el-Sheikh or Hurghada, 2 prime locations on the Red Sea here. And as the high season is starting, business is starting to come back, but not as strongly as last year.
Obviously, it's very depressing. A lot of people lost their jobs, companies are suffering, banks are not financing. It's difficult and rough times, but I mean, let me tell you that they're very courageous, and they will be surmounting the obstacles they're facing.
While everybody knows about Egypt, its baby brother Tunisia was much less well known amongst international travellers. In the main, it was Europeans who went to the country's beach resorts, and in particular to the holiday island of Jerba, crucially very close to the border with Libya. It was in Tunisia in January that the first shoots of what became the Arab Spring were seen, when President Ben Ali fled the country after weeks of popular protest. But the revolution cut annual tourist figures in half, leading to a controversial marketing campaign in Paris and London in which the country mocked its own reputation. Holidaymaker Gwen Meredith made the trip to Tunisia over what's been described as a catastrophic summer season, to find a country in transition.
When in Tunis, I came round the corner and suddenly there's barbed wire everywhere, but I felt safe there. Partly because the people of Tunis were just going about their business. They weren't upset, they weren't worried. I think they accepted that this was part of what had to happen. And it wasn't until later, when I started to think about it, that I realised it's not crowded. Normally I think a city like that would be very, very crowded with tourists.
There's no problem of security. We have talked about security, but you know, even in 2011, after a revolution, we have received more than 4 million tourists, and we hadn't had any problem. So the problem of security is over. And the war in Libya is over too. So you can come to Tunisia, have a nice trip without any problem and meet fantastic people.
And it's that opportunity to at last openly engage with local people, he says, which has made the country a more interesting place to spend a holiday.
Of course, the atmosphere has changed because we can meet the people. We couldn't meet the people before. They were afraid, they didn't talk with you. Now they're free, they can talk with you, they can give you the real story of the places. And this is wonderful.
The historical attractions of the region, if holidaymakers can be persuaded they'll be safe there, are exceptionally tempting. Libya, for example, post-Colonel Gaddafi, is widely tipped as a destination to watch. Its ancient sites, like the beautifully preserved Roman city of Leptis Magna, it's hoped will draw in more tourists than ever before, as the country recovers from civil war and security improves.
Libya has always been a destination for the cultured traveller, but the feedback I'm getting is that now there's a feeling that people know what Libya is, where it is, where they may not have known before, and they're expecting that it will become a hot destination.
But for now, there are still travel advisories in place.
At the moment, the Foreign Office warning is essential travel only to Tripoli and Benghazi. I've been speaking to our office there. Everything is safe in Tripoli and in Benghazi, so we're hoping that very soon the Foreign Office will lower their warning to a lower level.
And Libya is not alone. There have been warnings in place against travel to Yemen for some years now, and in the short term that's unlikely to change while the situation remains uncertain. For Syria, some of those warnings have been strengthened since brutal crackdowns on demonstrations began in January. The US, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand all advise against any travel to Syria, given the current volatility. As for Bahrain, well, that's a bit more problematic. The US, for example, warns its citizens to avoid all travel to parts of the kingdom, whereas Canada admits that most tourists don't have any problems there. Meanwhile, Gwen Meredith, having enjoyed her trip to the newly free Tunisia earlier this year, is now looking forward to December and her next holiday, to Egypt. And the pictures of unrest coming out of Tahrir Square are not putting her off one bit.
No, it doesn't make me apprehensive. These are people making their own choices in life, things that I take for granted. And I'm not going to go out with a gun and support them. I'm not going to march in the city and support them. But I can support the little one, the little people. The money that I take to Egypt with me is helping them survive while everything else happens.
Well, as ever, we'd love to hear what you think. Do you feel it's now safe to go back to the Arab Spring countries? Let us know at our usual email address. That's fasttrack@bbc.com. And that's the address some of you used following last week's programme about publicly subsidised holidays for the elderly or poor. It's something already happening in some European countries, and it's led Joss from France to write,
"It's the type of creeping communism that the European Commission is so fond of. It gives it more power if it can take our money and decide how it is spent. Small surprise that in these straitened times, the EC is demanding a 5% increase in its budget."
Joe from Malta agrees, and he's not mincing his words.
The Calypso project should be discarded overnight. It is disgusting for anyone to be sent on holidays when poverty is still rampant within the European community. Getting our priorities right should be the order of the day.
But some of you saw a slightly more nuanced situation and think it could help ease the continent's current cash flow issues. Les from Mallorca thinks it's an idea that needs expanding.
Spain needs to start talking and encouraging tourists from Northern Europe of all age groups to its mainland and islands. During the 5 or 6 months every winter it chooses to close down. It's got the climate and it would answer several economic problems.
And thanks again for all your emails. Do keep them coming. Now let's have a look at what else is making the news in the world of travel this week.
Europe's second biggest tour operator says it's business as usual after a 75% drop in its share price earlier this week. Analysts predict Thomas Cook will be able to operate normally with the support of its lenders and say even if it did collapse, package holidays are still protected by EU legislation. If you live outside the EU, contact your tour operator. A lack of snow is forcing some ski resorts in Austria to cancel their season-opening weekends. Artificial snow cannons are being used across Tyrol in a bid to encourage it to settle, but in some regions it's even too warm for that. If you've booked for December, try not to worry. Weather experts say they expect a fall in the coming weeks. And not a flake of it will touch these blue penguins in New Zealand. This group's just been released back into the sunny waters of the Bay of Plenty. 300 were rescued and cleaned up after a cargo ship ran aground there last month, spilling 400 tonnes of oil. Tour operators hope it'll also mean the return of trips into the bay. And thanks to everyone who wrote in about the whereabouts of the Puerto Princesa underground river, which has been nominated as one of the new 7 wonders of nature. Last week we said it was in Indonesia. It is in fact in the Philippines. Sorry about that.
Do stay with us because coming up after the break, Michelle's got her thermals on as she recommends things to see and do in Russia and Antarctica, and we talk vintage fashion as we go to Toronto to find out why this year's collections are so last year.